Howdy everyone. For today's Jolly Lark, I'm painting up this awesome new Talos giant from Parabellum Games. It's for their City-States army. If you've been watching the channel for a little while, you'll know that I've also painted up some Inquisitors and Hoplites for the City-States. So this is a terrific addition to that army. Thanks to them for sending me this model. I really appreciate it. I would have picked one of these up on my own if they hadn't sent me one, but I'm excited to get it painted. So we're starting off with a black primer coat with some white zenithal highlights on it. I thought this might be a good way to test out the new Army Painter metallic speed paints. I've got those here, plus a couple other kind of little bit oddball colors that I've picked up in the past few months that I'm curious to try and haven't yet. Some of Vallejo's Corrosion special effects and some of the really light Vallejo Xpress called Mummy White. I haven't had great luck with light Express colors, but we'll see. So I started with the black and white primer layer. I did this with rattle can spray primers plus a white ink through an airbrush, but you could also dry brush this. You could do this with white paint through a spray can. That'd be fine too. And I don't know, we start with this top-down white, something called zenithal primer layer, but it can be a really nice base for contrast paints. But what I was really curious to try here is how this works with the new Army Painter Speedpaint metallics that are supposed to be a metallic that works kind of like the Games Workshop contrast paints in that it's a self-shading paint. One thing I noticed straight away out of the bottle is that it's very thin. It almost has the consistency of like an ink. I think it's even a little thinner coming out of the bottle than a Games Workshop contrast paint. That's not a bad thing. See, going on the leg of the Titan here, it's got pretty good coverage. I'm not immediately seeing any shading qualities to it, but maybe that kind of kicks in as it dries, which is a little bit true of the contrast paints too. Straight off the bat though, sometimes metallic paints can be a little bit thick or go on. It can be hard to get them to go on in a really thin layer because you often don't want to thin them down with water. Thinning down a metallic paint can sometimes separate the metallic particles and make it get a little wonky. But this is really thin and is going on very smoothly in a nice thin layer. So see how the shading effect kicks in or whether or not it kicks in. I'm not really seeing it here, but as I'm putting it on, but I'm impressed with the coverage and the thinness of it. It's going on nicely over the primer coat. Like I said earlier, I'm using this model to test out a few different paints that I haven't tried before. So this is a little bit more of a product review and experiment video than sometimes some of my speed painting videos are. That being said, this model, all the footage that I recorded everything painting it, I'll edit it down, but all the footage was about 2 hours of painting. So even though this is a big model, there's a lot of surface. That doesn't necessarily mean that it has to take you a long time to paint. Now, because I'm unsure about the coverage of this paint or how well other paints will go over it, I'm kind of staying a little more in the lines than I sometimes do with my base coats. If you've watched some of my other kind of messy, fast speed painting videos, you'll know that often I paint the first layer on pretty fast, knowing that subsequent layers can cover up any mistakes. But here, I'm kind of trying to be careful. And I'm finding that the thin texture of the paint makes it relatively easy to go right up to the edge of a color area. It's pretty easy to control. Now, the other thing I'm seeing here with this is that the coverage is actually so good, I'm not really getting much benefit out of the black and white primer layer. You can kind of see on the shield here, there's really not much of a difference in how the silver looks, whether or not it went over the white part of the shield or over the darker kind of black part of the bottom of the shield. Kind of all looks the same to me. So maybe if you're planning to use the speed paints, maybe you don't need to worry about a zenithal layer. It seems like it does fine over the white and the black. So maybe something to try out. Could save a step, which, saving steps is what getting miniatures done is all about. So maybe it's not worth doing the white top-down primer layer, the zenithal layer, if you're planning to use these as the majority of the model. Right, so with the silver done, let's try out one of the Army Painter Speedpaint golds too. This is a very rich orangey gold. I feel like this is a nice color. I don't have a gold that's quite this color in my my paint collection yet. So, and like the silver, it's going on very smooth, flowing into some of the texture and providing pretty good coverage. Very good, behaving similarly to the silver, which is nice. You know, it's nice for paints within a range to be similar to each other and predictable. If you glance over on the left side of the screen here, see that I've got 2 water cups, and that's an important tip if you're working with metallics, to have a separate rinse cup for your metallics and for your regular paints. Especially these newer metallics have a lot of metallic pigment, a lot of metallic flakes in them, and you don't want to make your other paints glittery. So if I'm working with a little metallic, tip of a spear or something, whatever, but if I'm doing a lot of metallic painting, I usually grab a separate water cup to use for my metallic paints. And you can even see in the video, there's so much, this was starting a few minutes ago with clean water. There's enough metallic medium in the water that, watch when I swirl this here, you can actually see the metallic flakes swirling in the water. So you definitely don't want to mix that stuff into your regular paint colors. So just make sure to use a separate cup for that. Taking a closer look at what's happening with the gold over the darker areas, beginning to think that maybe these speed paints are designed to be used on a lighter prime coat. I didn't see that anywhere in the bottle, but I'll double check and see if I missed something. What I'm seeing here is that the gold color, because it is pretty thin, it's flowing into the recessed areas of this texture and is actually lightening the recesses a little bit. And where it's thinner on top, the top of the areas, the raised areas of the texture, the paint is settling away from those. And the darker primer is showing through more on the raised areas. So it's actually creating the opposite effect of what I'm looking for, where the paint is settling into the cracks and is lighter in the cracks and then is darker on the raised areas. I don't think that's gonna be a problem. I'm using these as kind of a base coat. I'm gonna add a wash on top. I'm gonna add a highlight on top. It's not an issue for this, but it's not what I necessarily would have expected. Although the same thing sometimes can happen with lighter colored contrast paints applied over a zenithal in the darker areas. You can end up with some color in the cracks and not color on the raised areas. So just something to watch out for. These might be better used with a lighter base coat and then applying shadows afterwards, but we'll see. This shoulder plate here is a nice, lightly primed, raised area with lots of texture. So I'm curious to see how the gold behaves on this. I still don't see a lot of self-shading the way you might get out of a contrast paint. Maybe a little, but I'm still happy with the thin texture. It's a nice, even coat of paint that's going on, kind of flowing pretty quickly and easily. So yeah, happy with this as a gold paint. I'm not sure that this is a one and done, painted on, call it finished sort of paint for me. I'd probably still want to hit this with a light wash and maybe a small highlight, but it's a solid gold. I'll keep this on my desk. It's a very nice warm gold too. Yeah, that's looking pretty good. The skin for this Titan, I'm doing a much more straightforward contrast, or in this case a Vallejo Xpress color space gray thin layer over all the skin, and something I've started doing sometimes with larger areas of contrast paints or express paints, translucent paints over a black and white layer, is putting it on with a little bit of water added. They have a decent drying time. They don't dry immediately necessarily. And then using either a damp brush or a sponge to just remove a little bit of the paint off of the raised areas to make the bright highlights just a little bit brighter. And then adding a little bit more of the contrast paints into the shadows to make the shadows that much a little bit darker. So just take like a makeup sponge. I like these dense foam makeup sponges. And just like a little dab onto the middle of the giant's head will lighten that up just a little bit. That can sometimes save a highlight step or two. I'm basically happy with the gradients on that head, and that's just from a single coat of the Vallejo Xpress Space Gray, lightened up with a sponge a little. Now, at this point for the model, obviously their base, there's a lot to do on the base that's not done. There's a pretty large area on the base still to do. There's the cloth at his waist that I'm going to do with some sort of translucent paints to match the Inquisitors that I did in an earlier video. So some sort of black and red there. And there's all these little kind of tubes and gribbly bits. But it's actually surprising. Like, this is a big model, and you can get most of it done with just a couple of colors and then brighten it up, take it up from there. And I've sometimes found when I'm trying to do a model quickly, it can be useful to grab some sort of like a dark gray, black contrast paint. In this case, I'm using Ratling Grime, which is a Citadel contrast paint, and just kind of go over any details that you're not 100% sure what the color they should be with a darker color. And then you can kind of look at the model and think about, what do you want to be lighter? In this case, I know that all these tubes and hoses and stuff, I want to be kind of a dark black gray. So just painting on the dark black gray contrast paint. I really think this Ratling Grime is a much better black in most instances than the actual black contrast paint. It's just got a little more richness. It's not quite so dark, and you get a little bit better highlights. You can create something similar by mixing the Black Templar paint with a little bit of contrast medium and thinning it down a little bit, but this works a little better straight out of the bottle. I'm just going to taking this dark black gray and filling in the cracks. Any little bits of tubing, mechanical doodads, there's some like cables that connect the shoulders to the arms. Just kind of going in and covering those all with this black gray to get a little bit of paint on everything. And sometimes the things kind of end up just disappearing, and it's not really where the focus of the model is, and you can just leave them that way. And sometimes you'll notice like, oh, that would look good with a little pop of color there. So going in, like just filling in the cracks, like this shoulder joint here. It's cool. Like, it's got a little bit of detail. I wouldn't want to just cover it in flat black, but adding that black gray contrast paint preserves the visibility of those details without actually taking very much time to paint them. All right, let's try one of the other new paints that I picked up recently that I haven't tried yet. So you're trying it along with me. This is the Vallejo Game Color Effects Corrosion, and it comes out very thin out of the bottle. And this is going to be hard to see in the video, but rubbing the paint, there's like a teeny tiny bit of grit in it that the paint actually has a little bit of texture mixed in, which is interesting. A little bit like the Citadel Typhus Corrosion. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but it does make it kind of a specialty paint that you're probably not going to want to slop all over the model or use as a base color because you're going to be adding a little bit of texture. But my goal with this is to make this metallic Titan look ancient, but not rusty. And I think this could be pretty good for that. This reminds me a little bit of an old Vallejo model color paint called Brown Glaze. I think that I saw the glazes on the discontinued rack of a hobby shop I stopped in on vacation a couple weeks ago, which is too bad. Those were kind of fun, but its behaves a little bit similar. This is not exactly behaving like a wash that's flowing into the cracks the way you might expect a wash to do. It has a little bit higher surface tension than a wash, but it's very thin. So you can kind of see what I'm doing with the sponge there. I'm putting some on, but I don't really want a full layer of it, and then I'm taking some of it off. It's a little strong just on its own. I think straight out of the bottle maybe would be better for doing some like grimy streaks or something like that. But for this sort of application where I want to kind of go all over, I'm going to grab some of the high flow medium, which is my current favorite paint medium, and mix a little bit of that into the paint to try to maintain it's a similar kind of thin viscosity while making it a little more transparent overall. And that's getting there. Depending on the look you were going for, that actually could be kind of a cool look on its own. Because I want this to look ancient and well cared for, I want it to have a little bit of a polished look. Like, I'm not shooting for armor that's caked in mud or that's been rotting in a tomb for 1,000 years or what have you. I'm shooting for an armor look that's old, very, very old, but has been cared for. I think this is a neat effect. It almost goes on a little bit like, I don't know, it kind of feels like mud, that it's pretty opaque. This is not a transparent contrast style paint, but it's pretty thin and it wipes off easily. I think this is kind of a neat look for ancient silver, to put a thinned down layer of it all over and then take some of it off with a sponge. I think something else that's kind of neat about it, based on it's a warm brown color. I'm going to try here putting it just all over everything on the shield, the gold and the silver. And a dark warm brown isn't a bad shade color for the gold, and it's still, even putting it all over the gold and the silver, it's not like it's making those look the same. It's having a different effect on the two different colors. It's shading the gold and weathering the silver. I think that's pretty cool. Now, one mistake I made here, because I haven't used this paint before, is that I put it all over the shield, including those gem areas. And later on, when I went back to paint the gems, I did notice that I could see, when using my magnifiers, I could see a tiny little bit of gritty texture on the surface of the gems' faces, which you would never ever notice in a game or on the table. But I did notice it while painting, and if I was painting this model again, I think I would use a similar technique. I'm happy with how it turned out, but I would just make sure to keep that Corrosion special effects paint off of any surfaces that I wanted to be smooth later, like the gems. Now, you can see while I've been talking here, the other thing I'm doing is taking some of the undiluted paint and kind of pushing it into the corners of things to darken the effect a little bit, and then feathering it out with the sponge from there. Here, I'm going to try to use some of the high flow medium, the golden high flow medium. I'll put a link to that below to create a much thinner wash. I'm just experimenting, just playing around. I want to see what it looks like when there's a much thinner wash. Now, when this first went on, you might be having the same thought I did, which is, whew, that looks really milky. That looks terrible. That's an effect of the medium. Something about this medium looks a little milky when it's wet, but it does dry clear. So I'm just trying to try things. This layer of very dilute corrosion all over this leg, and then we'll see how that looks like when it dries. So skip forward 2 or 3 minutes. I've put some more of the corrosion on other parts of the model, and you can see on that leg there, it's lost that milky look on the leg, and just looks fine. I actually think that watered down corrosion worked just fine. The Speedpaint Silver plus the Corrosion special effect really has created a nice, dark, weathered silver. And I say all the time in my videos, yeah, you could stop here. I think this looks just fine. But I'm going to add a little bit more visual detail to this. Let's zoom in and can see how the armor is looking. I think this looks cool. I think this is a cool look for the armor. But I think adding some bright scritches and scratches to it will really make some of the shapes of the armor pop and make it look like it's an ancient set of armor that's still seeing use. This hasn't just been sitting around, but this thing is striding into battle. And these little bright pops of silver tell that story that there's parts of this model where the corrosion or the age has been worn away by contact with the world. I'm using just a little bit of ripped up sponge to create this kind of a random pattern of effect here, and my favorite bright silver paint, which is the new reformulated Vallejo Game Color Silver. And I'm not just focusing on the edges, I'm also just kind of putting some of these teeny little dotted splashes on the wide flat parts of the armor, but you will end up catching some of the edges with the sponge too, and that's just fine. If it creates a little bit of some edge highlighting with a silver, cool. The sponge is an inexact painting method. You notice I'm doing this before I do any of the cloth, and maybe should have done this before the skin, but I'm just kind of careful not to do it around the skin. And this is kind of random, so if you just don't do these little scratches near the skin, it's fine. Just put them where they're easy to put them. While you got the silver out, doesn't hurt to grab a small brush, do a couple of odd, edge highlights, brighten up the edge, some of the top facing edges of some of the metallic surfaces. You don't need to go crazy with this. Metallics are, you know, a little bit self-highlighting anyway, and a little bit goes a long way. Just a few little edge highlights on the upper surfaces of the model. You should be good to go. Now, like I mentioned earlier, I wasn't thrilled with how the gold worked on the darker areas of the primer. So I'm just going to grab a little bit of Agrax Earthshade and sling that all over the gold areas. Just kind of darken up the gold a little bit in the darker areas on the lower part of the shield. So kind of putting it in around the edges of the gold area straight out of the pot. And then I'll grab a little water from the paint pot and kind of feather it out so that the raised upper areas of the shield aren't quite so dark. Focusing this Agrax Earthshade on the lower half of the shield's gold, plus any areas where the gold meets the silver to darken up that transition just a little bit. I'm a big fan of using my fingers while I paint, and so you get a little paint. Almost any paint can be rubbed off of a surface when it's still wet with your fingers. Your texture of your fingerprints is great for that. So you saw a moment ago, get a little bit of Agrax Earthshade on the silver, and just wipe it off with your finger. That's fine. It is a good reason, if you're using your fingers a lot while painting, to wash your hands before painting and try not to touch your face. You kind of keep your hands clean so that they're available to wipe paint off the models without getting your models greasy. Now, I basically like the color of that Speedpaint gold. I'm still liking it. I don't feel like it achieved a self-shading. I want the recessed areas of the gold to be darker, but I feel like that the Agrax Earthshade is actually doing a really nice job of that, and the real rich, warm color that this gold has pairs really nicely with the Agrax Earthshade. I think it looks good enough that I'm just going to do a little bit of the Earthshade all over all the gold parts of the model. And that is really bringing out some of the definition. For the cloth bits, I hit them all with the same black-gray contrast paint, partially because some of the cloth is going to stay black, like the Inquisitors for the army. But the parts, the two kind of red, the two skinny bits on the ends that I want to make red, I wanted them to have a scratchier, more worn texture, and not quite the smooth effect that the airbrushed white layer gives. So applying the gray contrast just knocks all of that down to be darker. Basically kind of wipes out the zenithal white spray. And I'm going to recreate the highlight layer with a ivory paint here, just using kind of a scratchy cloth-like texture. And this is a big model, so this is pretty easy to do pretty quickly. And then I'll put the contrast paint, the contrast paint on top of that. While I got the ivory out, and go ahead and add some little scratchy highlights to the tubes, just kind of where the joints of the tube meet each other and along the top of the tube, and then I'll darken those up in a little bit. Whenever you've got a little bit of ivory on your palette, it's not a bad time to brighten up any highlights that you think you might want to brighten, and then you can knock those back with another translucent layer if you're using contrast paints. So for the cloth here, with that scratchy layer in place, I'm going to grab some of the Flesh Terror's red contrast paints and just put a thin, even layer of that on top of the scratchy texture. Now, that's going to have some of that showing through, but then what you can also do with still a little bit of red on your brush, just take the teeniest, tiniest little dot of the ivory on the tip of your brush, and you can blend that ivory into the still wet contrast paints, and the ivory will blend with the red on the miniature. And it's a very quick way to get pretty smooth looking highlights. And you want to, again, just use like a really small amount of the ivory. It might take a minute to get the hang of this, but the contrast paints have a decent amount of drying time. And while you don't want to mess around with the contrast paints with water as they're drying, that can kind of rip up the layer of paint. But you can use paint to blend in here. Let's get a closer look here. And you just kind of put a thin layer of red. You don't want it really pooling in any of the cracks or crevices because you don't want the paint that you're adding to spread out into a pool of paint. And the contrast paint, like I said, stays wet a good long time. So with that thin layer of paint, you work reasonably quickly, but you don't have to be super rushed. I'm putting the red all over the whole thing. And then before that dries, grabbing a little teeny little bit of the ivory to blend in on the edges and raised areas. And you can kind of see where you start to put the ivory. It's going to be the brightest because the paint on your brush hasn't started mixing with the wet red paint yet. And so you can kind of use that to feather the highlights. So the first bit where you touch the ivory to the model is going to be the brightest, and then it's going to darken as it blends with the wet contrast paint that's already on the model. And you can keep doing that to get up to an even brighter highlight on the very tippy top edges of the cloth, like I'm doing here with this edge of the cloth. And then just pull that wet contrast paint in the edges and kind of go back and forth until you're happy with it. If you're not super comfortable with wet blending two paints into each other, the increased working time, the fact that the contrast paints don't dry quite as quickly as regular paint, really makes it easier to get a blended effect on the model. And like right here, I'm adding a little bit of contrast paint back in. I find that blending an opaque paint into a contrast paint is a faster and easier way to get a wet blended effect. So that's basically the model done. Let's give some of these other paints a whirl real quick. I'm going to try out the Express Color Mummy White, which is a light brown translucent paint in the vein of GW's contrast paints. I'm going to give that a try on these columns. The white primer layer has already created some shadows. And I'm already kind of seeing what I was afraid of with this, which is that the thin light brown paint settles into the cracks, and it looks okay, but it's not enough to, it doesn't quite work right over the darker black shadows, because the shading that's created from the Express paint isn't quite in the same spots as the shading that's created by the black and white layer. And especially on the darker areas, you can see on the top of the column here, it almost a little bit like the gold on the shield, the paint's flowing into the cracks of the darker area creates a little bit of lighter color in the recesses. That's not really what you're going for. I think this might work better through an airbrush where you're applying an even layer over the whole thing. I think that could work well. Yeah, I'm not sure about such a light color over a black-white underlayer. This, I think, would look better with a light blue underlayer or through an airbrush. It looks okay. It's kind of functions more to add like a layer of dirty grime than it does to add a layer of shading. And in the case of these columns, that's okay. If the shading is coming from the primer, the black-white primer layer, and the mummy white is adding a little bit of dirty grime, that's maybe not a bad thing. The color is very similar to the Vallejo Earth color that I tend to use as the final highlight on the bases, so that could pull it together. We'll see once we finish the base. For the big gems on the shield, I'm going to use a very similar technique that I used on the cloth. Gave the gems just a solid green undercoat, and then I'm going to put a thin layer of darker green contrast paint all over the gem. Then grabbing a little bit of, just a teeny little bit of white paint on the edge of the brush, going to put a little streak of white on one side, and then blend that into the green at the edges like so, and you're working with the wet contrast paint into the white. And that's a really quick way to create a smooth gradient on the bottom half of a gem to simulate how light is being kind of caught through the bottom of the gem and refracted through the bottom of the gem, because the light's coming from above, going through the gem and coming out the bottom. So you generally want the bottom half of the gems to be a little brighter. And just like the cloth, you can go back and forth a little bit, add a little white to brighten up the bottom edge. I'm kind of shooting for the bottom edge to be pretty bright white. You can add another little bit of green to smooth things out again, and just kind of work back and forth a little bit until you're happy with that, how that turns out. And you can see in real time here, this is, let me get the hang of it, this is a very quick way to add a blended gem onto a model. And then when you're done, you can add some little bright white highlights to the top of the gem, and I'll usually give it a gloss coat before calling the model done. Other than the base, I think all there is to do here is to grab the trusty Nuln oil and add a little Nuln oil to the transitions between the colors. This just kind of help the gold and the silver pop out from each other a little bit more. I kind of like the gradient effect that I did on the sword. I think I'm just going to leave that and add a gloss coat to it and a little bit of Nuln oil. The silver, when it dried, it didn't really have great self-shading, so adding a little bit of Nuln oil to kind of in between the fingers to some of the areas of the silver that have more detail, help those pop a little bit more. I was kind of hoping the Army Painter Speedpaint would have a little bit more of that shading. In between the fingers is a very deep crevice that seems like you would get that effect if you were going to get it. I didn't really see that, which isn't what I was expecting, but isn't bad either. I'd use this silver again as a nice thin silver paint. It almost feels a little bit like painting with silver inks. So I think that's my verdict on the Army Painter metallics in the end, is I'd use them again, but I'm not really sure that they do what I was expecting them to do, but still useful. Those will still have a place on my desk. But yeah, so this is kind of final Nuln oil wash. It's not all over. It's just trying to darken up some of the transitions between colors and make any little raised details on the metals pop a little bit more, like the toes and the ports and the valves and all that stuff. I don't think I've talked about what I did on the base, but to fill in some of the gaps in the base between the round base that it comes on and the stand that goes in, I just used some hot glue before priming to fill those gaps. And now I'm going to cover that kind of bumpy hot glue layer with some of the Vallejo mud effects. I am putting this on pretty thick with a popsicle stick. I was doing this late in the evening, and it took all night to dry. And then when I came back in the morning, it was still a little wet. I had to give it another few hours. So put on in a thick layer like this, it took about 16 hours to dry. So just keep that in mind. Give yourself a little time. This is not something to do the morning before a tournament. Popsicle sticks work great for applying this stuff and rubbing it around. Popsicle sticks, they're sturdy enough. Getting to the end of this jar here, but you can see all over, just kind of nice thick layer, blends everything in together, and we'll let that dry. Like I said, it took about 16 hours, and then we'll finish with the base and call this big boy done. Yeah, just a couple dry brushes of lighter browns with kind of a warm brown, and then the Vallejo earth I mentioned earlier will lighten up that dried mud and highlight the textures of that. And then we'll grab some tufts and stick some kind of a variety of brownish tufts onto the brownish earth. And we've got a new Titan ready to join the ranks of the city-states for Conquest Lost Argument of Kings. So if you're still watching, I really appreciate that. It's great to see people who watch the videos all the way to the end. It really helps the channel, and hopefully it means you found something useful. Hit subscribe so you don't miss out on future videos. I try to do a couple videos a month. Always happy to answer questions in the comments below. Hit me up with any questions you have related to the video or not. Any hobby-related questions, happy to help. And we will see you next time on another Jolly Lark.